The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University. This is EconVersations, a joint production of Troy Trojan Vision and the Manuel Johnson Center for Political Economy. Now, here's your host, Dr. Dan Sutter.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. Do you know much about car repairs? What about dentistry? Plumbing? Electrical wiring? Most of us do not, and that's good. Our lack of knowledge, though, can leave us in a difficult position when it comes to reviewing the expertise and credentials of mechanics and electricians. Does the person in the lab coat talking to us truly know medicine? Or did they, as the TV commercial puts it, just stay in a Holiday Inn Express last night? States and cities across the nation implement occupational licensing laws to help address the challenge of evaluating the expertise of alleged experts, with the hope of weeding out the quacks and the fakes before they can do harm. Occupational licensing, though, is a very strong form of government intervention into a market for professional services, but it's been proliferating across America over the past several decades. What are the effects of occupational licensing? And are there some reforms that might make this policy better for Alabama? Joining me on EconVersations today is one of the nation's leading experts on occupational licensing, Dr. Edward Timmons. He's the director of the NE Center for the Study of Occupational Licensing at St. Francis University in Pennsylvania. Dr. Timmons has authored a new policy study for the Alabama Policy Institute on licensing in Alabama titled The Not So Sweet Home Alabama, How Licensing Holds Back the Yellowhammer State. Dr. Timmons earned a master's and PhD in economics from Lehigh University and has extensively researched and written about occupational licensing, with publications on the topic in top economics journals, including, as we'll see, one on the case of licensing of barbers in Alabama. He was also a panelist on a forum that the Johnson Center held on licensing in Montgomery. Well, welcome to EconVersations, Ed, and thanks for joining us.
Dr. Sutter.
Hi. So let's get started here. You've done a lot of research on occupational licensing, but there was one study that you published in an academic journal, which I think would be of interest to our audience here, and it was looking at the case of the licensing, and actually it was a delicensing of barbers in Alabama. So tell us a little bit about what happened here.
So Alabama was the last state in the United States to license barbers, and they were also the only state in the United States to remove barber licensing. And in order to become a barber, you had to complete a minimum amount of education, you had to pass exams, and you had to pay some fees to the state. And Alabama was quite unique in that they removed this specific requirement.
And then I believe we ended up eventually, after some number of years, relicensing barbers as well, right?
That's right. So we take advantage of that unique period between 1983, when Alabama removed barber licensing, and 2013, when Alabama eventually reinstituted barber licensing.
And one of the reasons for doing this study is, as you explain in the paper, is that sometimes it's going to be easier to see the effects of occupational licensing when licensing goes away than it is to be able to see them when you start licensing something. So explain for us why that would be true.
Absolutely. So generally, when new licensing laws get passed, they contain something called a grandfather provision. Mm-hmm. And what this provision allows for is that existing barbers or existing professionals will have a pathway to begin working without completing the new licensing requirements. So if this is the case, then we might not necessarily expect the effects of licensing to be observed immediately. On the other hand, with delicensing, it's more immediate. Right away, everybody has the opportunity to begin working in the profession without meeting the original licensing requirements. So we might expect the effects to be observed more quickly with delicensing as opposed to licensing itself.
Now, you were looking at the case of barbers, and that might immediately, like, well, a number of our viewers might find that a little surprising, because you might initially think of things, licensing as applying to professions like medicine or lawyers. You have to get a bar license, or maybe architects, where you have extensive study that's required to learn something. And so obviously it must not be the case, since barbers, as you mentioned, are actually now licensed in every state. But so it seems, is that actually a pattern that we see, that licensing applies to less, I guess, knowledge, less some professions that don't require the same amount of training as med school?
Absolutely. If we were to go back several decades to the 1950s, about 5% of workers were subject to licensing. And most of those workers were doctors, dentists, occupations requiring more extensive education, and where there might be an argument that could be made that perhaps consumers would be exposed to some significant harm if they received treatment from an unqualified professional. But what we've observed in the decades since the 1950s is a significant expansion in licensing, and now it's more like 1 in 5 workers rather than 5%. It's more than 20% of workers that are subject to licensing. And we've seen licensing spread to barbers, massage therapists, even florists in Louisiana are licensed in order to begin working.
Now, before we talk about what you found with the case of Alabama barbers, what in general would have economists found to be the effects of licensing on different professions?
So what we've observed with respect to the effects of licensing is that if you make it harder for aspiring workers to enter the field, and basic supply and demand would tell us that if you restrict the supply curve, that we would anticipate that wages will rise, and that's going to materialize in the form of higher prices for consumers and potentially less access to services.
Now, presumably, because it would take a long time to actually go to med school or to barber school, presumably that greater education or training is going to lead to higher quality service, and you could weed out the quacks. Do we see any evidence of that working in these markets?
It's quite mixed. There was one historical study that looked at licensing of midwives, and that did find some positive effects of licensing. But for the most part, there's very little evidence that occupational licensing improves quality. And I suspect that in a market like barbering, where the definition of quality is much more subjective, I suspect there would be even less evidence that licensing is in fact improving quality.
And just from a standpoint of economists trying to do research, when you mentioned that all states license barbers, that actually puts us at a disadvantage, because one of the things we like to be able to do as a researcher is, like, if some states license a field and others don't, you can try to make cross-state comparisons. And so you really have, from a research standpoint, there's a bit of a difficulty in trying to figure out what's going to happen when a profession ends up being licensed everywhere, right?
That's absolutely right, and that's why I was so excited to identify Alabama as a specific case study. It really provided a unique opportunity to better understand the effects of licensing on wages and consumers.
So, if you can, explain a little bit to us, what you were looking for in this study, looking at the Alabama barbers, and what were the effects of getting rid of licensing in 1983?
Absolutely. So what we found is that when Alabama removed licensing, barber wages in the state fell by about 8%.
Mm-hmm.
We also found some evidence that the number of cosmetologists fell as well following the removal of licensing. And we also did observe some reductions some increases in the number of practicing barbers in Alabama as well.
Now, you mentioned the fact with cosmetologists. So if you can explain a little bit, and you might need to explain to us exactly what a cosmetologist is, and then how it is that could end up being related, and why as economists we might look to find an effect of licensing of one profession on another.
Sure. So traditionally, cosmetologists primarily serve females and barbers primarily serve males, although that line has begun to blur in the last several decades. One of the unique distinctions between the two professions is that barbers give shaves, even though it is becoming less common, but they have the ability to do so. And oftentimes cosmetologists can also do nail styling, and barbers generally do not have that ability to do so. So they're very closely related professions, and we might expect that these two services would substitute for one another.
Okay.
So if all of a sudden Alabama removed barber licensing, it would be as if cosmetologists potentially faced more competition as a result. So we thought it'd be interesting to take a look at how the removal of barber licensing affected cosmetologists as well.
And then on the flip side, if you thought about when barber licensing came back in Alabama, were cosmetologists involved or affected by that as well?
Absolutely. The loudest voice, interestingly, in the room pushing for the reinstatement of barber licensing was in fact the Cosmetologist Association in Alabama. And in fact, now barbers are licensed by the Board of Cosmetology. They definitely were very much in favor of reinstituting barber licensing in the state.
Now, as economists, we have to go beyond simply like looking at, making comparisons of the average wages in one state versus another, because there are other things out there that might be driving wages at the same time. And so our research tries to actually go on and make sure that anything you might be able to see in terms of a simple comparison actually holds up. So if you could tell us a little bit about the method that you used to try to figure out, because in effect you were trying to say like what would have happened in Alabama if they had not gotten rid of licensing. And so that's ultimately the research question as a researcher, what you were trying to get at. So tell us a little bit about how you went about doing that.
Absolutely, and that's exactly right. What we tried to do is we tried to imagine, or we tried to put together an alternative universe, if you will, where Alabama kept barber licensing. So we use this methodology called synthetic control. And what it does is it tries to put together this alternative version of reality, if you will, and it attaches weights to other states. So there might be some percentage attached to Mississippi, some percentage attached to Florida, and using that, we estimate what Alabama would have looked like had they not removed licensing. And we then compare the two. We compare what actually transpired in Alabama versus what happened in this synthetic, if you will, version of Alabama.
And that's really important. Again, from the research standpoint, we always have to try to come up with some, we use the term counterfactual to describe this, but it has to be a really credible counterfactual because you don't actually observe it. And so in research, it's because you're making all the comparisons relative to the counterfactual. You just don't want to be accused of having simply made up something that is going to make you get the results that you want. You have to trying to come up with the most credible counterfactual that we can that's really what our research is all about. All right.
Absolutely, and the beautiful thing about synthetic control is it's data driven. So, you as a researcher don't really have any sort of influence. The data essentially guides you towards attaching those weights and developing that counterfactual.
Well, we want to move on to a study or a report that you put out for the Alabama Policy Institute earlier this year, and talk a little bit about what that policy does, or what that study did. Because in that case, instead of doing research, you were offering some possibilities for reform, and I thought it was some very intriguing ideas for how we might change the process here. But before we think about reforms, we want to mention, I mentioned this in the intro, but I wanted you, if you could elaborate on this. Occupational licensing is only one of a number of different types of interventions that the government could have in a professional services market. And so there are alternatives. And so what would be some of the alternatives that we could have if you didn't want to have licensing?
There are a variety of alternatives. I mean, first off, the market itself is an excellent regulator. If I'm a barber and I'm doing a bad job, I'm not going to be in business for very long. Word's going to spread pretty quickly, and especially now with online reviews, that reputation matters a great deal. And if I'm providing poor quality service, it's not likely that I'm going to be in business for very long. I won't be in business for very long. In between the market, which, as I said, is an excellent regulator, and licensing, which is the strictest form, it's illegal to work without meeting some minimum amount of education and requirements, you have inspections. And this is something that gets done in the restaurant industry. Restaurant staff, the chefs, the wait staff, they're not subject to licensing. Instead, we just use certification. You can have bonding. Tree trimmers generally are not licensed. They are licensed in some states, but what we use in this case is bonding. If I have somebody cut down a tree and my neighbor's property gets damaged, I'll know that tree trimmer has insurance in case something like that were to happen. You also have private certification, and this is what gets used with auto mechanics. There's a very well-functioning private certification of auto mechanics. Auto mechanics aren't subject to licensing. So there's a wide array. Probably the best representation of all of these alternatives is something called the inverted pyramid that the Institute for Justice put together. And at the top of the pyramid's market competition, at the bottom is licensing. And there's a whole host of other regulatory alternatives that aren't as costly and prohibitively expensive as licensing.
And that's important as, I guess, context here, because we have seen licensing, the most extensive form of intervention, proliferate across the country. And so, and if a group goes to a state legislature to ask for licensing, I mean, the legislature is not a group of economists or others who might be able to review from an economic standpoint what's going on there. About one suggestion you offer, and this comes for Alabama, would be what's known as reciprocity of licensing. And so explain to us a little bit what that's about.
Yeah, so the reform that I recommend would entail that Alabama would simply accept the licenses of other states. And generally, the license holder would have to have that license for at least 1 year. The license would have to be in good standing. But that is a straightforward way to remove a lot of the barriers that are generally associated with licensing moving from one state to another.
And that's one thing that research has shown, is that licensing raises wages, but it also restricts mobility, right?
That's absolutely right. There's a really well done study that looks at the effects of licensing on interstate mobility, and they find that if states make it harder for individuals to move from one state to another with their licensing restrictions, that mobility declines by about 7%.
And there's one group that I know has gotten some attention with regard to this impact of licensing and restricting mobility, and that's military spouses. Because, I mean, first off, if you're a doctor and you're going to move from one state to another, you're only going to do that if you're going to be able to either transfer your license or get a new license once you transfer that. But if you're a spouse of somebody who has to move for another reason and you were licensed in one state, you could be in a situation where you now no longer can legally practice your profession, right?
That's right. And military members, service members do tend to be more mobile than the rest of us. So, this is an issue. And I mean, as you said, it could be completely unplanned. Mm-hmm. So the spouse very well might find themselves in a situation where they're not able to use the skills that they've acquired. And that hurts them. It hurts the rest of the members of the state as well, because they don't have access to that provider service.
And in the case of a military spouse, if they're likely to move on again in a few years because their spouse gets stationed somewhere else again, it really could be a case that is simply not worth it for the 2 or 3 years they might be in Alabama to go through the whole licensing process again, even though they were already licensed in another state. But then they just don't have the ability to work while their spouse is here in Alabama, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it wouldn't make sense to go through all of that process for just a couple of years.
And so there are some, I mean, I think I've read this carefully, that there are some professions in Alabama that do have license or this reciprocity accepting out-of-state licenses. But this would be, what you would be proposing is sort of like as a rule for all professions, right?
That's right. It sometimes gets referred to as universal recognition. And I should point out that Mississippi just passed this same type of reform this legislative session. And more states are adding to the list. This is a reform that I think makes good sense. And, especially when we're thinking about military families and individuals that are more mobile, it seems to be a good common sense reform.
Especially since this lack of mobility, or when you don't respect the out-of-state license, impacts a handful of people very hard, and it can be a real hardship. And I know there's even research showing that one of the prime issues in terms of officers leaving the military is the inability of their spouse to find fulfilling employment or while moving around as a military spouse. So I think that makes a perfect sense as a relatively minor thing. And it also makes sense in terms of like states respect out-of-state driver's licenses. And so, if we're going to accept driver's licenses from other states, then can't we accept barber's licenses from other states and so forth, right?
Absolutely. That's a good analogy.
Now, another proposal that you offer in this study for API is what's known as a sunrise review of licensing. And so tell us a little bit about this, what sunrise review is, and you might need to talk about the sunsetting review, because people who follow public policy might have heard of sunset reviews that occur in Alabama and a number of other states, and sometimes are very contentious. So tell us a little about sunsetting, and then I guess the sun also rises is what you're going to propose here.
That's right. So a sunrise review would expose new legislation to review. So if, for instance, there was a proposal to license genetic counselors, let's say, in Alabama, the state would have to review, or some other body would review and make sure that the benefits associated with that licensing legislation exceeded the cost. So, some sort of basic, if they're done well, some sort of basic cost benefit analysis of that new legislation to make sure that it's in the public's best interest. Sunset legislation, on the other hand, is a review of existing legislation. So perhaps the state of Alabama, as it did in 1982, might review barber licensing and make a recommendation that the costs associated with that regulation exceed the benefit. Now, unfortunately, what oftentimes happens with sunset review in particular is it is a little bit scattered. It doesn't necessarily occur with any regular interval. Other states that do it well, they might subject a certain percentage of occupational licensing rules or other legislation, to be frank, to some sort of sunset review, or they might have an expiration date where the legislation will simply expire unless it gets renewed. So sunrise legislation, I think, makes a lot of sense, because what I found in looking at licensing is that once it's on the books, and I think this is true of a lot of other regulations as well, once it's established, it can be really hard to get rid of. And the market changes. The regulation might not necessarily be working the way that it was intended to work. I did a study several years ago where we documented all of the cases of delicensing that occurred over a 40-year period, and we were only able to find 8. Sunset processes, oftentimes recommended removing licensing, but there was no clear-cut next step. There wasn't any action taken following those recommendations.
Well, and I think, especially given that there are these alternatives to licensing, and the fact that licensing represents this most extreme form of intervention, I think it makes perfect sense to say, well, hey, if a patient wanted to try to get some prescription sleep aid, they have to go to a doctor, and the doctor is going to diagnose the thing, and they might not be able to get like the strongest sleep aid right off the bat. They might have to, the doctor's actually going to review their case and see if that's what they need. Or the same thing with prescription pain medicine. I mean, you're not going to just hand that out, and you're going to rely on expert opinion. And legislators aren't experts on these things. They're drawn from all different walks of life. So I mean, I think this is something that just thinking about from the standpoint of, oh gee, you wouldn't you tell somebody to go to a doctor before they get a prescription, right?
Absolutely, yeah, and it just doesn't make sense to jump right to that most restrictive regulation.
Yeah, especially if you want to try to give a less extensive form some opportunity to work for a while. So we were nearing the end of our time. So just sort of to wrap up here, is there anything you'd like to add?
I think if there's one important takeaway from all of this, it would be that licensing is not the same thing as regulation. I think too often the two get equated. There are all kinds of other regulatory alternatives that don't have the same costs. And it would be great if there would be some recognition that we can protect consumers without imposing the costs associated with licensing.
Well, thanks very much for coming on and talk about this with us. I enjoyed it very much. And thanks you all for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.
This has been EconVersations, a joint production of Troy Trojan Vision and the Manuel Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University.